I still remember the room as it was when you came down the stairs in the house that I grew up in. The first half of the basement you encountered was where we spent a lot of our time. And about halfway across the room was the brown recliner that was my dad's seat as we watched TV and sat around in the basement. And I was sitting on the couch across from him. He was eating a bowl of ice cream, and I was bearing my soul. I had finished my freshman year in college and was trying to decide if I should transfer back closer to home because I was at a school that only had engineering degrees, and I wasn't sure I wanted to do that, and all my friends were closer to home, and there was all sorts of other things going on. Also, I grew up in a house where we weren't allowed to quit things. Like in third grade, I said, I don't want to play soccer anymore, and they said, well, you signed up, so you got to finish. That freshman year in college, I loved wrestling in high school, so I thought I'd join the wrestling team at a little small Division III school, and I quickly found out that college wrestling is a whole different thing for which I was not equipped. So I quit. That was a hard thing to quit, that when I grew up in a house where quitting wasn't allowed, and now here I was trying to decide if I was going to quit this school and go do this other thing, and I asked my dad all kinds of questions, and he just kept eating his ice cream, and what did I want him to do? Tell me what to do. But he would not do that. Today we hear Jesus say, do unto others as you want them to do unto you. And if I operated literally with that, I would just be telling everybody what to do because I wanted him to tell me what to do. But he knew that he wouldn't be around all the time and that I would need to be able to make decisions without him just telling me what to do. Now, he's been dead 23 years, and he wasn't there when I bought a house and wanted him to be there to help me figure out how to do that, and I've had to figure out all kinds of stuff. But the way he interacted with us was to kind of make us figure that stuff out for ourselves. It's easy for me to remember him on All Saints' Day, even though he was, I think, sober 20 years when he died, and I don't remember too much from the time before that. And the last couple of years of his life, he had some struggles. But for me, I just remember him being present all the time. He was one of our coaches. I could talk to him about anything. So when we light candles later and remember saints, that's an easy one. It's easy to remember my mom, too. She could frustrate me as well. I work on Sundays. That wasn't always true, but my mom would call me every Sunday when I was pastor, mostly after I was done for the day, but sometimes she would call at like 10 o'clock in the middle of worship. She wouldn't leave a message, and then she'd call the house to see maybe if I picked up there, and then she'd call my wife and say, he's not answering his phone. Yeah, I work on Sundays. Leave a message. I'll call you back. But for all of those little bits of frustration, my mom was always present. She never missed any of our games, and so on All Saints, it's easy to remember her. And All Saints is kind of this tender space where we're going to read a bunch of names later and remember those people. So earlier this week, when I cracked open the Bible texts that have been appointed for this day, which means some decades ago, some church people from a bunch of different denominations got together and came up with a whole calendar of readings, and they said, these will be good for All Saints' Day. And if you heard them, they're not easy All Saints texts. First, we had a story from Daniel where he's having this vision of kings coming up in the earth. And if you read the whole story, it's all kinds of terrible stuff happening. Then we read a psalm that at the early part sounds pretty good. It's talking about praise the Lord. And then it ends with vengeance and violence. Then we get this prayer from Paul, and then we turn around and get a gospel lesson, not about remembering our dearly beloved, but about blessings for those who are poor and hungry and mourning, woes to those who are rich and filled up and laughing, and then all this stuff about praying and loving and caring for those who curse you, hate you, those people that you consider enemies. And I found myself asking, how are these the texts for All Saints? And the more I wrestled with it, the more I actually came to understand that this is actually a perfect gospel for All Saints' Day. And I'm going to tell you why I think that. First, we had a pretty high-profile funeral lately. Anybody remember which one that was? The Queen, right? Now, if you listen to the gospel, blessed are the poor, blessed are the hungry, blessed are those who mourn, versus woe to the rich, woe to those who are filled up and those who are laughing. Which side does the queen fit on, blessings or woes? Woes, right? Extremely rich, always had plenty to eat, and you didn't see her laugh on TV a lot, but I'm sure she had times where she was full of laughter, right? And so when we hear this gospel and you think, wow, yeah, so there's the queen, here's what I know to be true. In this community of Orlando, we have a whole bunch of organizations that work with homeless people, and they all have their own missions and things that they do, but one of the things that they collectively have worked at is trying to make sure that no homeless person in Orlando dies without someone knowing their name. So around about December 21st each year, there's a funeral downtown for all the homeless people that died, and all of their names are read, and it's been quite a while since they had a person that they had to call Jane Doe or John Doe because no one knew them. But the day the Queen died, I guarantee you, somewhere in this country, and probably most countries in the world, someone died that no one noticed, or no one knew their name. Maybe somebody buried them someplace or somehow put them to rest and just had to pray to God or commend them into the Lord's care without having any idea who they are. So as we read this gospel, that sounds kind of challenging on All Saints' Day, we read it in a world where there's people with great power who everybody knows died, and people who get forgotten. And what Jesus is doing is telling us that the way the world works, if you're successful and rich and powerful, you get remembered. And if you're poor and hungry, maybe you don't really count. But Jesus is flipping that all around, and I think the people that heard this the first time would have been a little shocked when he said, "Blessed are the poor," and those people that are hungry, and those people that are mourning. He's flipping around the way we understand the world works and says it works different. So on All Saints' Day, we don't just remember the people that are obvious and successful and powerful. We're also called to remember the people that we didn't even notice. And what we learn, though, is that God sees us all. And God remembers each and every one of God's children. That's the first thing. Second thing, like I said, my parents were not perfect. Like as Lutherans, we talk about being saints and sinners simultaneously all the time, right? But for me, especially it's been long enough since they died, it's pretty easy for me to remember my parents on All Saints. But even as I think about that, I remember the call I got from a young man who told me that his grandfather had moved into hospice. Now, this was a guy who doted over his wife, and her funeral, he was very particular to make sure we celebrated her life well. Now, hospitals are busy places. If you've been in the hospital, you know you don't get to sleep well because they're poking and prodding and testing things all the time. But there are parts of the hospital that are quite quiet. And when you take the elevator up to the hospice floor and open the doors, you might not see anybody. It doesn't mean that care isn't happening, because there is a whole bunch of care that happens in that place. It's just quieter. And so you walk past these empty rooms, very conscious of your footsteps, because they're the loudest thing in the hallway. And I found his room, and there he was, not conscious, and all by himself. There wasn't a grandchild there, and none of his children were there. Now, I don't know why. I don't know the story, but I don't think it was simply that they couldn't make it, right? I had another woman once ask me if I could do a funeral for her dad, and I said, sure. And she said, it will be a hard one to do. And I said, why? And she said, because he was, and then she said a not nice thing about her dad. And what she remembered about her dad was that he was a terrible father to her and her sisters. Never present. He was alcoholic. He was not around. But his drinking buddies thought he was amazing. And she said, how do you do that? And quickly, the answer is, you just stand up at the funeral and you say, he was complicated. And everybody goes, yeah, we know, because we know, right? But in both of those cases, you have people for whom remembering their parents on All Saints' Day is not so easy, because their parents and the relationship they had with them was not great. And I would bet that all of us have someone for today, when we light a candle, that we don't want to light a candle for them, because we don't want to remember the difficulty that we had with them in life. We don't want to remember them as the saint of the sinner and the saint. Now, as hard as that is, I would bet that for at least one person, for all of us, we are the person that are hard to remember. And I know, I could make you a list of people that I'm pretty sure don't want to remember me on All Saints. As soon as I make that list, you know what I'll tell you? Well, I don't think that was all my fault. I think that was a lot of that, right? I'm already wanting to defend myself and equivocate about how that is. But the reality is, we're messy as people. And there are saints that are hard for us to remember, and saints, us, who are hard for other people to remember. And yet, on All Saints' Day, we don't say, today we celebrate some of the saints. We celebrate all of them. What did Jesus do when he was hanging on the cross? Father, forgive them, for they knew not what they are doing. Even as Jesus was being crucified, he forgave we who put him there. So in All Saints, we can remember, first, that God remembers all of us and sees all of us. And second, that in Jesus, each and every one of us is forgiven, even the ones who might be hard to love and remember. Third thing. Any of you know what the Augsburg Confession is? That's okay. We'll have adult confirmation in January, and you can join us online on the second and fourth Mondays of the month. During Luther's day, as the Reformation was getting rolling, he wrote the small catechism and the large catechism, which get more attention. But the Augsburg Confession, the Holy Roman Emperor demanded to be told, what are y'all teaching in your churches? And so they wrote it down and sent it to him. And it's all these articles, and the articles talk about what they believed about all sorts of things. And what they believed the church to be is Article 7, if you want to go look it up. And what they said the church was the gathering of the saints, where the word is rightly proclaimed or taught and where the sacraments are rightly administered. Which means that as we gather today, assuming the word is rightly taught and the sacraments are rightly administered, then we're the church, but the church is the saints that are gathered here, right? So if All Saints is about remembering all the saints, we're still here. It's not just about remembering those that have passed. So if you come back to this gospel text again, on the one hand, Jesus is telling us to flip the world around in the way it works, but then on the other hand, he's telling us that there's saints that are still around that we could be interacting with in different ways because of Jesus flipping things around on us. That very last bit, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, I've already said that's not always so easy because I wanted my dad to just tell me what to do. And with a little bit more years and wisdom, I understand why he didn't, right? But I think it's an invitation for us to have some imagination. Because doing unto others as we would have them do to us isn't always so easy for us to sort out. So I'm going to invite you for a minute to imagine the homeless person that you encounter out on the streets. And try to imagine how they got there. And the reality is, that's hard for most of us to imagine. Because we think, oh, well, if I didn't have any place to live, I would just go call my brother. Or I would go to those friends. They would give me someplace to live, and they just might. But guess what? I've sat with someone who would have had a hard time imagining all of that as well. Until he hit a patch in life where his grief was so deep that he sought comfort in alcohol and drugs. And guess what? When he was high, he didn't think about all that grief. And when he started to think about it again, it was pretty easy to just get high again. And pretty soon, his wife left with the kids. And then he lost the house. He lost his job. He alienated everybody in his life until he didn't have a place to live. Now, it might be hard for you to imagine going through each and every one of those steps until you're living on the streets and don't have any food to eat. But imagine that it did happen, and you're hungry. What would you do? Well, you might just go stand at a street corner and hope someone would give you a couple of bucks. Now, when we encounter those people, in a world where we celebrate that the Queen has been successful and we forget about the people we don't see, it's easy to say, well, he's probably just going to go spend that at the liquor store. Or, well, maybe he's out here just faking it because, I'm seeing him around a lot. Maybe this is how he makes his living. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can fill in. But if that was you and you were hungry, what would you want someone to do? Just give you a couple of bucks, right? This is what Jesus is inviting us to do, is to have some imagination that the people that are around us, some of whom are very hard to love and interact with, some of whom might be abusive to us and all manner of other things, some are mean and nasty, to try to imagine what it must be like to be them, so that as we interact with them, we do toward them as we would want them to have to do toward us. So back to that question about people that might be hard for you to remember on All Saints' Day. If you're hard to remember, what do you want someone to do for you? Forgive you? Think maybe that have a party, right? This gospel text is a hard one to sit with on All Saints. And we're going to light some candles in a little while, and we're going to remember people that were easy to remember. But as we light those candles, I hope we can also give a thought to those that might be harder to remember. And all the while knowing that God remembers each and every one of us, that in the death and resurrection of Jesus, each and every one of us is forgiven, and that with all of that, we are invited to imagine that God's vision for the world can actually come alive, and that we are invited to help make that happen each and every day. Amen.